Good day to all of you. In our fast-paced, bustling world, the morning often comes with a whirlwind of tasks demanding our attention. It is so easy to jump into the day, checking the list of obligations we've set before us, without truly pausing to consider the direction of our steps. Yet I believe that the great secret of the human condition, and indeed of the divine human relationship, lies in the simple act of beginning each day by seeking God's guidance. We often speak of finding guidance, but I believe it is not so much a matter of finding, but of opening ourselves to what has always been available, the quiet, steady hand of God. It is there, waiting, not for the perfect moment, but for the earnest heart that turns to it. The morning, then, is a sacred time. It is the beginning of our daily opportunity to acknowledge that we do not walk this journey alone. Now, let us first ask, why the morning? Why not simply when we feel like it, or in moments of crisis, or in the middle of our workday? The answer lies in the very nature of human beings. We are creatures of habit. And habit, though often maligned, is a powerful tool for shaping our lives. If we begin the day in prayer, if we begin the day seeking guidance, we are not merely setting a mental intention, we are creating a pattern that can guide us for the rest of the day. But here's the crux of it. We are free beings, and God does not force His wisdom upon us. In His masterful way, Cecil reminds us in the Screwtape Letters that free will, even in our search for divine guidance, is the bedrock of our relationship with God. God will not impose His will upon us, but He delights in those who actively seek Him. And this act of seeking, however small it may seem, is one of the most profound ways we acknowledge our dependence upon God. Yet there is a caution to be had. It is a temptation, especially in our modern age, to rely purely on our own reasoning and our own plans. I'm sure many of you have heard the advice to trust your instincts or rely on your own wisdom. But Lewis, in his unparalleled wisdom, often warned us that human reason, though a marvelous gift, is imperfect. The complexity of life, the many layers of our hearts and minds, cannot be fully understood through intellect alone. It is the guidance of God that, like a light shining in a dark place, illuminates the path before us. Imagine then each morning as a moment of surrender, of opening oneself to a wisdom far beyond human intellect. It is as if we are entering a room where the Master sits, ready to offer His counsel. Our job is not to dictate the terms, but to listen, to humble ourselves before the source of all wisdom. Now, what will this act of seeking God's guidance each morning bring? It will not always be a loud voice or an immediate solution to the problems we face. No, often it is a quiet nudge, a sense of peace that rises within, or a simple thought that seems to cut through the noise of the world. But I assure you, as you seek God's guidance daily, you will find yourself slowly transformed. You will become more attuned to His will and more courageous in following it. In conclusion, each morning is a fresh opportunity, not just to check off another item on your to-do list, but to align your will with that of the divine. If we begin our days with this simple act of seeking, we are not only setting the tone for the hours ahead, but positioning ourselves for a life transformed. As C.S. Lewis so often showed in his works, this is the true path to meaning and fulfillment, a life led not by our own understanding, but by the gracious hand of a loving Creator. Thank you. Starting the day with purpose is one of the most foundational aspects of how we approach life. And it is especially crucial when we consider the context of spiritual life. We, as human beings, are creatures of habit. Whether consciously or unconsciously, our daily routines shape not only our actions, but also our outlook on life. Each morning, as we rise from sleep and begin to open our eyes to the world around us, we are presented with an opportunity to set the tone for the entire day. This act of setting our minds and hearts on what truly matters is of paramount importance, particularly when we consider our relationship with God. It is in the quiet moments of the morning that we can align our minds with divine wisdom and our hearts with divine purpose, ensuring that every step we take throughout the day is in harmony with God's guidance. To start the day with purpose means to begin each day with an intention, not just to carry out the ordinary tasks that lie ahead, but to approach them in such a way that our hearts are open to God's will. It's easy, in the rush of the modern world, to overlook the importance of this quiet preparation. We often rise, hurriedly check our phones, consider the list of things to do, and dive into the tasks of the day, leaving little room for reflection. However, C.S. Lewis reminds us in his writings that there is something inherently valuable in pausing before we rush headlong into our daily routines. To begin each day with reflection, to center ourselves on God, is a practice that helps us navigate life with purpose and intentionality. The morning represents a clean slate, an untouched canvas on which we can begin to draw the shapes of our day. It is during these first moments that we can choose to invite God's guidance into our lives. It's a chance to surrender our desires, our plans, and our expectations to God, trusting that He has a far greater wisdom than our own. The great Christian thinker and writer C.S. Lewis often spoke of the importance of surrender and humility in one's walk with God. Beginning the day with purpose, with prayer, is an exercise in that very surrender, a deliberate action to set aside our own will in favor of God's. What does it mean to start the day with purpose? At its core, it means that we do not allow the world to dictate how we will feel, what we will focus on, or how we will respond to the challenges ahead. When we wake, there is always the temptation to fall immediately into the mindset of the world, to respond to the demands of others, to the distractions of our environment, or to the pressures of time. These things can quickly fill our thoughts and emotions if we let them. But by starting the day with purpose, particularly through a spiritual practice such as prayer or meditation, we take control of our inner life before anything external has the chance to influence us. This is where the concept of seeking God's guidance becomes crucial. Purpose isn't just about achieving goals or being productive. It's about aligning ourselves with God's greater purpose. It's about looking at each task, however small or mundane, as an opportunity to serve Him. Every conversation, every email, every meal, every decision can be an opportunity to honor God and fulfill His purpose. After asking God, the morning prayer, then, is not just a petition for personal strength or wisdom, but an invitation for God to direct our steps and open our eyes to the deeper significance of what we are doing. When we wake up with a sense of purpose, we also cultivate an awareness that life is not merely about going through the motions. It is not simply about meeting deadlines or achieving personal goals. There is a deeper, eternal aspect to everything we do. C.S. Lewis, in his reflections on life and faith, often underscored the idea that our lives are part of a grander narrative, one that has spiritual meaning beyond what we can see or touch. By starting the day in this awareness, in quiet surrender, in seeking guidance, we allow ourselves to step into this larger narrative. We remind ourselves that our actions are not insignificant, but that they are part of something far greater than ourselves. This purposeful start to the day also invites us to confront the inevitable challenges that will arise. The day ahead is rarely free of difficulty. We face challenges both big and small, decisions to make, relationships to manage, work to accomplish, personal struggles to endure. Without purpose, without seeking God's guidance, these challenges can overwhelm us. They can leave us feeling burdened, anxious, or defeated. But when we begin the day with prayer, when we acknowledge that we need divine help, we invite God into our challenges. We remember that we do not face the day alone. God's guidance will see us through. It is also essential to recognize that purpose is not about controlling every outcome, but rather about being faithful in the midst of uncertainty. By seeking God's guidance in the morning, we acknowledge that there will be things beyond our understanding, and we embrace the unknown with faith. We trust that God will provide wisdom when needed, strength when we are weak, and peace when we feel anxious. We can move into our day knowing that the outcomes are ultimately in His hands, and we can rest in that assurance. The morning, therefore, becomes a powerful opportunity for spiritual renewal. It is a time to recalibrate our hearts and minds, to step away from the noise of the world, and to intentionally turn toward God. When we start each day with purpose, when we seek His guidance, we create space in our hearts for the divine to act. This practice doesn't just impact the way we begin the day, it affects everything we do. Our actions, our attitudes, and our interactions are shaped by the decision we make in the morning to seek God first. And over time, this practice transforms our lives, deepening our relationship with God, and helping us to live with greater clarity and peace. In summary, the importance of starting the day with purpose cannot be overstated. By taking the first moments of the morning to align our hearts and minds with God's will, we set a course for our day that is filled with intention, meaning, and divine direction. It is a practice that strengthens our faith and grounds us in God's eternal wisdom, allowing us to move through the day with a sense of peace and assurance, knowing that we are walking with God by our side. God's guidance is not something reserved for the select few, nor is it a rare and elusive gift meant only for those who are exceptional in their faith or their piety. One of the most profound and accessible truths in Christian theology, and one that C.S. Lewis often highlighted, is that God's guidance is available to all who seek it, regardless of their status or level of spiritual maturity. And this is most definitely at the heart of this book. This is a crucial idea, for it speaks to the open-hearted generosity of God, a God who desires to lead every one of His children, no matter how frail or imperfect they may be, into a deeper understanding of His will and purpose. We often think of guidance as something that is only accessible to those who are particularly devout or spiritually advanced. We may imagine that only the saints or the deeply holy individuals have a direct line to divine wisdom, but this is far from the truth. In fact, God's desire to guide us is not based on our own worthiness or ability to achieve spiritual perfection. It is based on His unending love and mercy, in the same way that a loving parent guides their children, even when they stumble or falter. So too does God offer His guidance to all who earnestly seek it. There is no requirement of extraordinary virtue, no prerequisite of perfect holiness, only a heart that is willing to listen, to receive, and to follow. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis famously writes about the inner voice, the conscience, that all people possess, regardless of their spiritual awareness or knowledge. This inner voice, he argues, is an echo of God's guidance, placed within each person, whether or not they are consciously aware of it. It is a universal part of the human experience, a gift from God that calls us to recognize right from wrong, truth from falsehood, and light from darkness. Even if we have not explicitly asked for God's guidance, He has already placed it within us, ready to be accessed when we open our hearts and minds to His will. This idea is central to the Christian understanding of grace. We are not, as some might argue, left to fend for ourselves in the labyrinth of life. Rather, God's wisdom is always available, always within reach, and always willing to lead us if we will only seek it. It is not a matter of God withholding His wisdom from those He deems unworthy, but rather a matter of us actively seeking it. The very act of seeking is an expression of our openness to God's presence and direction in our lives. The Christian life, therefore, is not one of self-reliance in the strictest sense. It is not about making our own way with our own strength and wisdom alone. Instead, it is about recognizing our need for God and allowing His guidance to be a guiding force in everything we do. From the most ordinary of decisions to the most significant life choices, God's guidance is available to all who would seek it. It is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process. We are invited into an ongoing conversation with God, one where His guidance, wisdom, and love are poured out on us daily, if only we are willing to receive it. End quote. Many people, when they think of seeking God's guidance, may imagine that it is a complicated or mysterious process, that it requires a particular ritual or an extraordinary experience. Yet God's guidance often comes in quiet, everyday ways. It may come through the whisper of the Holy Spirit, through the Scriptures, through the counsel of wise friends, or through the still, small voice within our own hearts. The guidance we seek does not always come with dramatic signs or overwhelming revelations. It often comes as a gentle nudge, a prompt to make a certain decision or to take a particular action. We must be attentive to these moments, listening for the divine in the quiet spaces of our lives, for it is here that God is often found. C.S. Lewis, with his characteristic clarity, reminds us that God's guidance is not always about telling us exactly what to do at every turn. Sometimes God's guidance is about inviting us into a relationship of trust. It is an invitation to walk with Him in faith, even when the path ahead is unclear. Rather than giving us a detailed map for every moment of our lives, God asks us to step out in trust, knowing that He will provide the next step when it is needed. This dynamic, as Lewis often pointed out, reflects the nature of our relationship with God, one based on trust, love, and faith, rather than mere obedience to a set of rules or instructions. It is important to recognize that God's guidance, though available to all, is not always understood or immediately embraced. Often we may be slow to seek God's wisdom, relying instead on our own intellect or our own desires. We may be tempted to dismiss His guidance when it does not align with our own plans or wishes, and yet it is precisely in these moments that we are called to deepen our trust in God's wisdom, to trust that He sees the bigger picture and that His guidance is always for our good. As Lewis wrote in the Screwtape Letters, "We are in the hands of a good God who desires to bless us. Even when we do not understand His guidance or see its purpose, we must trust that it is ultimately for our flourishing. God's guidance, then, is not a rare treasure reserved only for the spiritual elite, but a constant and available source of wisdom for all who seek it. Whether we are struggling with a difficult decision or simply navigating the routines of daily life, God's wisdom is there, ready to direct us. The key is not to wait until we are perfect, or until we have earned His guidance, but to approach Him with humility, seeking His direction in every aspect of our lives. Through prayer, through Scripture, and through the stillness of our hearts, we are invited to listen for God's voice and to trust that He will lead us faithfully, day by day. The role of free will in our relationship with God is one of the most central and profound aspects of the Christian faith, and it is something that C.S. Lewis explored in great depth throughout his writings. In the context of seeking God's guidance, the exercise of free will plays a crucial role. God, in His infinite love and wisdom, does not coerce us into following Him. Instead, He offers His guidance freely, inviting us to choose whether or not we will listen. Prayer, then, is not a mere act of asking for assistance. It is an active exercise of our free will to ask God for His wisdom and to align our desires with His will. Free will is one of the greatest gifts that God has given to humanity. It allows us to make choices, to shape our lives, and to navigate the world around us. Yet it also brings with it the responsibility to choose wisely, for the choices we make have real consequences. This is where the need for God's guidance becomes clear. On our own, our free will is often shaped by our desires, our fears, and our limited understanding. We may think we know what is best for us, but our perspectives are narrow, and our wisdom is finite. In seeking God's guidance, we acknowledge the limitations of our own understanding and open ourselves to the possibility that God's wisdom surpasses our own. C.S. Lewis, in Mere Christianity, discusses the importance of freely choosing to follow God. He writes that God does not want mere automatons who follow a set of rules without understanding or love. He desires instead a relationship with beings who choose to love Him and to follow His guidance willingly. This free choice, however, is not a one-time decision. It is a daily exercise of the will, and we must constantly choose to seek God's guidance, not just in moments of crisis or when things are going wrong, but in every decision, no matter how small it may seem. This is the heart of what it means to live a life of faith. It is not about a one-time surrender, but about a continuous act of choosing God each and every day. When we approach prayer and seeking God's guidance, we are, in essence, engaging our will in the act of surrender. It is an intentional decision to submit our plans, our desires, and our lives to God's greater wisdom. This surrender is not a passive act. It is an active choice to allow God to shape our lives according to His will, rather than clinging to our own ideas of what we think is best. It is, in many ways, a paradox. We exercise our free will most fully when we surrender that will to God. In doing so, we align ourselves with the divine will, which is ultimately for our good and for the flourishing of the world around us. Moments in life when we are faced with difficult choices, when the path ahead is unclear, or when we are unsure of what God wants us to do, in such times, prayer becomes a way of engaging with God, of seeking His wisdom and guidance. It is an act of humility, acknowledging that we do not have all the answers, that we cannot navigate life's challenges on our own. But prayer is also a demonstration of trust, so that we land on the right side of things. By choosing to pray, by choosing to seek God's guidance, we are expressing our belief that He is present and willing to lead us. This is the essence of faith, trusting in God's goodness, even when we cannot see the way forward. Prayer is not about forcing God's hand or demanding specific answers. It is about opening ourselves to God's will and trusting that He will lead us in the right direction. In his book, The Great Divorce, Lewis imagines a fictional conversation between a man and a spirit, where the man is urged to let go of his old life in order to embrace something greater. The spirit explains that the choice to follow God requires the exercise of free will, and that it is not something to be done passively. It is an ongoing decision to let go of the old and embrace the new, to step into the life that God has for us, even when it means leaving behind our own desires or our preconceived notions of what we want. This, too, is part of seeking God's guidance. It is a willingness to allow God to shape us, even when His guidance challenges our own desires or expectations. I myself tell my clients that the best way to live our lives is to try to imitate even when their own desires or expectations. In this sense, prayer and the seeking of God's guidance become an ongoing dialogue, not a one-sided request. Prayer is not merely about asking God to do things for us, it is about engaging in a relationship with Him, one in which we listen as much as we speak. As we pray and seek God's wisdom, we must also be open to the ways in which God might be calling us to change, to grow, or to act. We may not always receive the answers we expect or desire, but we can trust that God's guidance is always for our ultimate good. At the heart of this process is the notion of transformation. The more we engage in this exercise of free will, choosing God's guidance over our own instincts, the more we are transformed into the people He created us to be. This is not a passive process, it requires active participation. It requires us to listen, to discern, and to act in faith. Over time, as we practice seeking God's guidance, we begin to see the world through His eyes. Our desires, our motivations, and our actions gradually become aligned with His will, and we find ourselves living in greater peace, knowing that we are walking the path He has set before us. Thus, the act of seeking God's guidance is inextricably linked to the exercise of our free will. It is through choosing to listen to God, to follow His wisdom, and to surrender our own plans that we experience true freedom, the freedom to live according to God's will and to become the people He created us to be. It is not an easy path, nor a simple one, but it is the path that leads to peace, fulfillment, and a deeper relationship with God. In this way, seeking God's guidance becomes not just a daily act of prayer, but a lifelong journey of transformation, one choice at a time. The role of humility in seeking God's guidance is crucial, and yet it is often one of the most difficult virtues to cultivate. Humility, by its very nature, challenges our pride, our tendency towards self-sufficiency, and our desire for control. In the modern world, where individualism and self-reliance are often celebrated, the idea of humbling oneself before God can feel countercultural, even uncomfortable. However, as C.S. Lewis often pointed out in his writings, true spiritual growth requires a deep sense of humility. It is only when we acknowledge our limitations, our weaknesses, and our dependence on God that we can fully open ourselves to His wisdom and guidance. Humility is not merely about self-deprecation or a false sense of inadequacy. It is not about thinking less of ourselves, but about thinking of ourselves less. True humility, as Lewis describes in Mere Christianity, is about recognizing that we are not the center of the universe and that our understanding is finite. It is about acknowledging that, in our human frailty, we are in need of guidance, and that we cannot navigate life's challenges on our own. Humility requires the willingness to admit that we do not have all the answers, that we do not possess the wisdom to navigate every situation perfectly. In fact, it is precisely because of this recognition that we turn to God for help, knowing that His wisdom is greater than ours. For C.S. Lewis, humility is not a one-time decision, but a daily practice. It is the continual act of laying aside our pride and our desire to control, and instead submitting ourselves to God's will. This is not to say that we abandon our personal responsibility or cease to make decisions, but rather that we approach every decision, no matter how small, with a spirit of humility, recognizing that God's guidance is always more reliable than our own understanding. We seek His wisdom not out of weakness or fear, but out of a deep reverence for the Creator, who knows the end from the beginning. The act of seeking God's guidance is itself an exercise in humility. When we pray, when we ask for God's direction, we are admitting that we do not have it all figured out. We are saying, "I need help," and acknowledging that we are not self-sufficient. This is often a difficult thing for many people to do, especially in a culture that values independence and self-made success. There is a natural resistance to dependence, especially on something beyond ourselves, but humility involves setting aside that resistance and recognizing that dependence on God is not weakness, but the path to true strength. In fact, humility is the gateway to spiritual growth. The more we practice humility, the more we find that we are able to hear God's voice and follow His guidance with clarity. Humility clears the way for God's wisdom to take root in our hearts. Without humility, our own pride and self-will become obstacles that prevent us from truly listening to God. When we insist on following our own path, when we trust only in our own judgment, we close ourselves off to the transformative power of God's guidance. But when we humble ourselves, when we acknowledge that God's ways are higher than our ways, we open ourselves to His transformative presence in our lives. On some transformative presence, we accept Him as a friend. Humility also involves recognizing that God's guidance is not always what we expect. Often, God's wisdom challenges our own understanding. It may lead us down a path that seems uncertain, difficult, or even contrary to what we desire. Humility requires the courage to trust God, even when His guidance doesn't align with our own desires or expectations. This is one of the central themes in Lewis's The Screwtape Letters, where the demon Screwtape advises his nephew Wormwood to encourage the human to rely on his own understanding and desires, rather than to humble himself before God. The human, in this case, is urged to dismiss God's guidance if it doesn't align with his own sense of what is good. The point of this advice, as Lewis demonstrates, is that when we humble ourselves before God, we open ourselves to guidance that may not always be easy to follow, but is always for our ultimate good. Lesson 3. Moreover, humility in seeking God's guidance also means being open to correction. It means recognizing that we may not always be right, and that God's guidance may at times point out areas in our lives that need to change. For many of us, this can be a deeply uncomfortable experience, as it requires us to confront our flaws and our imperfections. But it is precisely through this process of correction that we grow. C.S. Lewis understood this dynamic well. In The Problem of Pain, he writes that suffering and hardship often act as tools for God to shape us into the people He created us to be. The humility to accept God's correction, to acknowledge that He may be leading us in a direction that challenges our comfort zone, is a key part of spiritual maturity. Humility also shapes the way we interact with others. When we seek God's guidance with humility, we recognize that we are not the only ones in need of His wisdom. Humility opens our hearts to the needs of others, encouraging us to listen to their voices and to offer them the same grace and understanding that we ourselves seek from God. It reminds us that we are part of a larger community, one in which we are all in need of God's guidance. As we humble ourselves before God, we learn to treat others with the same humility, acknowledging that we are all in need of His grace and wisdom. Thus, we can set our minds solemnly aside to the special blessings of God. Ultimately, humility is not a burden, but a pathway to peace. The more we humble ourselves before God, the more we find that we are able to trust Him fully, knowing that His guidance is always for our good. We learn to let go of our need to control, to manage every detail of our lives, and to trust that God's plan is greater than our own. As Lewis reminds us in his reflections on Christian humility, it is when we stop trying to be the center of the universe that we begin to see the world as it truly is, a place filled with God's grace, love, and wisdom. In seeking God's guidance, humility is the key that opens the door to deeper spiritual understanding and transformation. It is the willingness to admit our need for God, to surrender our will to His, and to trust that He will lead us to the fullness of life He has promised. Through humility we find not only guidance, but also peace, as we align ourselves with the wisdom and love of the Creator. Living out God's guidance in daily life is perhaps one of the most challenging aspects of the Christian faith. It is easy, at times, to seek God's guidance in moments of crisis or when faced with difficult decisions. However, the true test of seeking God's direction comes when we are called to live it out in the mundane moments of everyday life. How do we apply the wisdom we seek in our prayers and reflections to the routine and seemingly insignificant choices that make up the bulk of our days? This is where the rubber meets the road. This is where our relationship with God and our understanding of His guidance is truly tested. C.S. Lewis often emphasized that the Christian life is not just about grand moments of spiritual insight or dramatic acts of devotion. It is, in fact, in the daily, ordinary decisions that we make where we are called to live out our faith. Whether it is in our relationships with others, our work, or even our leisure activities, every moment offers an opportunity to live according to God's guidance. This means that seeking God's wisdom is not just a matter of prayer, but a matter of practice. It requires action, consistency, and intentionality. One of the first steps in living out God's guidance is recognizing that it is not confined to certain areas of our lives. Many people tend to compartmentalize their lives, thinking of God's guidance as something relevant only to spiritual matters, but not to things like work, relationships, or personal pursuits. However, if we truly believe that God is sovereign over all aspects of our lives, then we must understand that His guidance applies to every area of our existence. Whether we are making decisions at work, interacting with family members, or engaging with our communities, we are called to live in a way that reflects God's wisdom. God is not merely interested in the big decisions. He is concerned with how we live in every moment, no matter how small or seemingly inconsequential. If you are uncertain, strive to spend more time in prayer, in meditation, focusing on the great mountain of wisdom, and expanding your window. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis writes about the importance of integrating our faith into every aspect of life, not just in moments of religious observance. For Lewis, being a Christian was not something that could be separated from the rest of life. It was a worldview that had to influence every action, every thought, and every decision. This means that living out God's guidance is not just about doing things in church or following spiritual disciplines, but about how we interact with others, how we carry out our responsibilities, and how we manage our emotions and desires. It requires us to bring God's wisdom into the ordinary spaces of life, from the simplest decisions to the most complex. Living out God's guidance also requires intentionality and consistency. It is not enough to seek God's guidance once and then go on autopilot. It is a continual process of aligning our will with God's. This means that we must be vigilant and intentional in listening for His voice in every decision, large or small. It is all too easy to fall into patterns of self-reliance, making decisions based on our own desires or on the immediate circumstances that present themselves. But in every situation, we must remember that God's guidance is available and that His wisdom is far better than our own. This requires a discipline of attentiveness, a constant willingness to pause, listen, and ask, "What would God have me do in this moment?" C.S. Lewis famously spoke about the need to live out our faith with a sense of purpose and intentionality. In his book, The Screwtape Letters, he explored the ways in which the enemy, Satan, distracts humans from living out their faith in practical everyday ways. The key to resisting these distractions is intentional living. Being mindful of the choices we make and how we act in every moment, the enemy seeks to lull us into spiritual complacency, to make us forget that our faith is meant to shape every aspect of our lives. But Lewis argued that living out God's guidance is an active and deliberate process, one that requires us to be present in the moment, aware of our thoughts and actions, and conscious of the ways in which we are called to live out God's love and wisdom. Another important aspect of living out God's guidance is the need for perseverance and patience. There will be times when we feel uncertain or when the way forward seems unclear. There will be moments when we make mistakes or when we fail to follow God's guidance as we should. In these moments, it is crucial that we do not give up. Seeking and following God's guidance is not a one-time effort, but a lifelong process. As Lewis wrote in The Great Divorce, the Christian life is about constant growth and transformation. It is about becoming the person God intended us to be, which is a journey that takes time, effort, and persistence. We may not always see the fruit of our efforts immediately, but we must trust that, as we continue to seek God's wisdom and guidance, He is shaping us, refining us, and making us more like Him. It is also important to recognize that living out God's guidance does not always lead to immediate success or outward rewards. There will be times when following God's guidance will be difficult, when it will lead us into situations of sacrifice, suffering, or misunderstanding. However, as Lewis often pointed out, these moments of trial are an essential part of the Christian journey. In his book, The Problem of Pain, Lewis explains that suffering is not meaningless, but can be a tool for refining and shaping us into the people God has called us to be. Living out God's guidance may not always lead to outward success, but it will always lead to spiritual growth and deeper intimacy with God. The journey of living out God's guidance is not a solitary one. We are not meant to walk this path alone. One of the key ways to live out God's guidance is by being part of a community of believers who can encourage, support, and hold us accountable. C.S. Lewis wrote extensively about the importance of Christian fellowship in the Four Loves and Mere Christianity. He believed that the Christian community plays a vital role in helping us live out God's guidance. Through mutual support, shared wisdom, and encouragement, we are better equipped to make decisions that align with God's will. In this sense, living out God's guidance is not only a personal endeavor, but a communal one. Finally, living out God's guidance in daily life involves a deep sense of gratitude and trust in God's provision. As we seek His wisdom and live according to His direction, we are reminded that He is always with us, guiding us, providing for us, and leading us into the fullness of life. Our daily acts of obedience and trust are not merely duties or obligations, but acts of love and devotion to the One who is always faithful. In conclusion, living out God's guidance in daily life is about more than just asking for His help in times of crisis. It is about cultivating a lifestyle of attentiveness, humility, and intentionality. It is about recognizing that God's wisdom applies to every area of life and actively seeking to align our actions with His will. Through perseverance, community, and trust in God's provision, we can live lives that reflect His guidance and bring glory to Him. As C.S. Lewis teaches us, the Christian life is not just about belief in God, but about living out that belief in every moment, in every decision, and in every action.